So maybe I will begin still while people are still connecting, making a few words of introduction, and then telling you a little bit more about how we have organized the webinar. The striking moment for me is that we are just 2 days before the 5th anniversary of the Paris Agreement. And it reminds us that 5 years ago, we had a series of very important multilateral commitments or multilateral agreements that were decided. I just named the Paris Agreement, but of course, we are all aware that the Paris Agreement was also a part of a global conversation where we had the Agenda 2030 decided in September at the General Assembly of the United Nations, and also the action agenda of Addis Abeba on financing sustainable development. And these 3 pillars are very important that we remind all of them when we discuss how efficient we are in implementing those very important international decisions. Paris Agreement, Agenda 2030, they set a long-term goal, a long-term vision. And that's, I think we are just experiencing recently the fact that there has been an acceleration in the political dynamics globally with all the countries, European Union, UK, Japan, China, South Korea, I think South Africa also, but Mohan, you can contradict me if I mistake, if I'm too over optimistic, but I think South Africa, these countries declared an objective of carbon neutrality in the longer run. I think this is exactly what we had intended with the Paris Agreement, that these dynamics would accelerate and that countries would align behind such a long-term objective. But I think what we hear a lot in the public opinion is now that we need to make those objectives real. We need to make the international political dynamics become real, and that we see economic decisions aligning with carbon neutrality and with Agenda 2030, and also that there is sufficient funding to do so, which is particularly important in times of recovery of the crisis. So if we have a recovery plan, is it aligned with carbon neutrality and Agenda 2030? And if we don't have a recovery plan, because in some countries we don't have the fiscal space to have public resources for a recovery plan, how are the financial flows at scale and aligned with those objectives? This is a key question we have for the period, but it's really the defining moment of this decade of acceleration between 2020 and 2030. We need to accelerate now. So we have to think of the alignment between short-term decision and long-term objectives, and this is exactly what this webinar is about. You have in the Paris Agreement a key instrument that is called the long-term low emission development strategies, LTLEDS, which is a complicated name. At IDRI we say long-term strategies, LTS, it's a little bit less long. And so they're a legal instrument from the Paris Agreement. And we want to discuss to what extent this is an instrument that helps us mobilize, but also evaluate the alignment with the long-term objectives. And in that regard, because of what the context of crisis that I have just described, public development banks are a major player to try and mobilize the funding and see how they can contribute also that the funding that is mobilized is aligned with those long-term objectives. And so we are taking the opportunity of a recent report by a consortium called DDP-LAC, which stands for Deep Decarbonization Pathways for Latin American Countries. And that report was issued last week. I will synthesize in a few words the main findings so we can have the conversation not on the report, but on the consequences or on the findings of the report. So it was published last week, and it concludes three-year project in Argentina, Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Mexico, and Peru. The study was supported by the Inter-American Development Bank, the French Agency for Development, and the Platform for Pathways to 2050. And it had 4 main goals: capacity building of local research institutions. The second goal was to establish a modeling community to enable knowledge sharing on these long-term low-emission development pathways or strategies. The third goal was to develop policy-relevant and scientifically robust analysis of the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, and country-driven deep decarbonization pathways that would be consistent with the Paris Agreement objective and domestic socioeconomic priorities. And the fourth objective was, of course, the engagement with domestic policy processes, that these studies would matter in domestic policy processes. If I come to the conclusions of the study, it's highlighting that in all of these countries, low emission trajectories are feasible development pathways. And they can provide a number of benefits for social welfare, economic prosperity, air quality, biodiversity. So yes, in each of these countries, we have been able to determine such a pathway. However, there are significant challenges that must be planned for, avoided, and overcome. And so the long-term strategies that are asked for in the Paris Agreement can help inform the policy packages that are required to meet these challenges and overcome these obstacles, and simultaneously deliver climate goals and national development priorities. So what we want to try and discuss today is, in practice, how could key players like public development banks take on board these types of analysis of long-term development pathways in their daily life, in their daily functioning, in their operation, in their strategies. And we have the chance and the honor to have three eminent representatives of quite contrasted banks with different situations and different ways to have a role in the system: a regional development bank, a bilateral development bank, and a national development bank. And I would say on three continents, although AFD, the French Agency for Development, is not specifically a European bank because it's intervening in different contexts. The idea, and I will present our three panelists in a moment, our ideas was to ensure that we could understand from your perspective as practitioners in public development banks, how you can use those knowledge products that are the long-term development deep decarbonization pathways, and also how to see how we could share experience and lessons on how to make that even more useful. So just to introduce how the panel is going to function. In a minute, I will be giving the floor to one of my colleagues, Maria Alejandra Riaño, because she's been publishing a study on not climate alignment, but Agenda 2030 alignment of public development banks, what that means for a bank, at what level of the organization does that need to imply a change? In changing what? In project evaluation, in strategy, in dialogue with other stakeholders. So I think that's the important point. And you notice that for us, aligning with climate and aligning with Agenda 2030 needs to be designed jointly. It's complicated, but it needs to be designed jointly. And what I think the study by Maria Alejandra is going to help us do is to understand the variety of places that changes might need to happen if a bank wants to be able to align with Agenda 2030. And that might be food for thought to then discuss how long-term climate-aligned development strategies can be of use for public development banks. So now I come to our three invitees on top of my dear colleague Maria Alejandra. We have three, as I said, three representatives of different types of public development banks. First, I'm going to present Mr. Graham Watkins. Graham is the Chief Climate Change and Sustainability Director at the Inter-American Development Bank. There's a multilateral development bank working at the scale of the American continent. Thank you, Graham, for being with us. We also have the chance and the honor to have Laurence Breton-Moyer. Laurence is the Director for Strategy, Partnerships and Communication at the French Agency for Development. The French Agency for Development has, for instance, a commitment to be 100% Paris aligned. So that's probably something that is challenging and where you might discuss to what extent the types of products that we are discussing today, these long-term strategies, is that useful for you when you have set yourself such a commitment. And we also have a representative of a National Development Bank. So Laurence, thank you very much for being with us. And we have also a representative of a National Development Bank, Mr. Mohan Vivekanandan, who is the the group executive origin and the client coverage of the Development Bank of South Africa. And DBSA is one of these key representatives of national scale development banks that were under scrutiny at the mid-November in Paris at the Finance in Commons Summit, where the whole summit was a lot about having a focus on these national scale development banks, so all the role that they can play in aligning with Agenda 2030 and climate commitments. And I believe that DBSA is one of the banks that actually is pioneering or trying or experimenting lots of these things. So thank you very much for you to be here, Mohan. It's a pleasure to have you three here. So without further ado, I think the idea was just to say, from an analytical point of view, Maria Alejandra, how have you observed what it means for such organizations as public development banks to align with such a complicated agenda as Agenda 2030, but such a major, politically necessary agenda as Agenda 2030? The floor is yours, Maria Alejandra.
Thank you, Sebastian, and thank you all for joining us today in this event. As you were saying, first, I think it's important to highlight that we are experiencing a comeback of public development banks, because we are seeing that they are not capable only of mitigating market failures, but also playing a countercyclical role in times of crisis. And in the study, we also were able to identify that they are gaining every day more terrain as supporters and financiers of long-term transformations, as the ones that you were referring to. Here it's important to say that we shouldn't talk about any transformation, but a transformation and a recovery that is responsible, that is fair, that is equitable, and that is compatible with low carbon trajectories. And certainly public development banks can become these drivers of change in territories and help shape a better future from a local and global perspective. But as we identified in our study, for these banks to become allies, it's important that they really embrace and fully capture the interconnectedness and the interlinkages between the sustainable development goals. It's not a matter of just choosing one or two SDGs and incorporating them in their strategies, but really understanding that systemic and comprehensive approach is needed for them to be able to have more impact and more impact in the long run with their investments. In the assessment that we did, which actually DBSA and AFD and the IDB were some of the banks that we reviewed, we understood that, and we were able to see that public development banks are indeed implementing innovative practices within their strategies, within their operations, and in the way that they engage and relate with their stakeholders, using the SDGs and the 2030 agenda as a powerful tool. We identified, for example, that there are banks that are reframing their strategies and are incorporating cross-cutting topics for them to be able to have a comprehensive impact on the ground. We also were able to see that some other banks are having a more comprehensive approach at the portfolio level, ensuring that from the beginning to end, they include SDG considerations into the way that they create their projects, the way in how they follow up these projects, and how they assess the true impact in the end of each financing. And we also were able to see that at external level, they are using the SDGs and the 2030 agenda as a tool to have strategic discussions and conversations with key stake actors from the government and from the private sector, but as well are trying to identify new financial tools, for example, to finance long-term transformations on the ground. And this is the case, for instance, of the recent SDG bond framework that was published by AFD and by some other banks in Latin America, in Brazil. Here I want to highlight that it's important to understand that the logic behind alignment shouldn't focus only on trying to reconcile climate and SDGs, but really understand that climate change is embedded in the broader framework of sustainable development. And in this sense, what we must try to do, and what would be interesting for public development banks to try to do, is align economic, social, and environmental goals in an agenda of transformation towards a carbon neutral economy and an equitable and inclusive society. Also in the study, we said, okay, public development banks do things at internal level, both at strategy, operations, and external engagements, but there are certain conditions that also need to be in place for them to be able to really have an impact and for them to be really able to succeed. And one of these conditions is having clear policy frameworks by the side of governments that provide them with direction and that provide them with guidance on which are the country's long-term sustainability priorities. Because without these, actions are not as accurate and as impactful as they could be. And here, I think, is where the topic of this webinar that bring us here today to discuss the long-term strategies gains relevance, since I think it might offer an entry point for public development banks and for other financial actors that operate on a particular country to invest in a way that is coherent, that is aligned with long-term sustainable development objectives, and which is helpful to accelerate just, resilient, and low carbon transitions. This would be like my initial remarks for you to open up the discussions with the practitioners that I'm pretty sure will provide us with very interesting examples of what they are doing on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria Alejandra. So we have, my colleague Maria Alejandra has set the scene, and I think the first thing is probably to enable you three to have a first statement of how you see, if you agree actually with how we've positioned the webinar, the importance of this question of alignment, and introduce also how your organization is dealing with that. And after that, I will have three more specific questions to ask you. But Graham Watkins, so Graham is Chief Climate Change and Chief of the Climate Change and Sustainability Division at the IADB, the Inter-American Development Bank. Graham, how do you position yourself in this context?
Okay, well, thanks for the invitation to be here. What I'm going to do is basically sort of carry on the discussion a little bit and talk about sustainable recovery and why we need sustainable recovery, and then talk about how whatever you do with sustainable recovery, it needs to think long term, and then finally finish off with what we've been actually working on with respect to decarbonization pathways. In terms of the need for sustainable recovery, I mean, I do want to start off by being very pragmatic and saying that a lot of our investments during 2020 have really been focused on people's health, on jobs, or retaining jobs, or trying to create jobs in the absence of jobs, liquidity for small to medium-sized enterprises, and on how to manage the fiscal spaces that have been sort of very much tightened at this time. And in essence, we've shifted a lot of our support towards those things. However, at the same time, you're also seeing that actually a lot of people in Latin America and the Caribbean want to see sustainable recovery. They want to see the future economic growth to be sustainable, and there are many reasons for that. And we actually think that sustainable recovery is a very efficient and effective way of delivering the jobs and economic growth we want to see in the future. It's actually a huge opportunity. We also also know that Latin America and the Caribbean is also very susceptible to pre-existing development gaps. So things like inequality and informality have been around in Latin America. And perhaps this is the opportunity to actually, firstly, take that into account in recovery, but also to try and address some of those issues. We've seen huge impacts on informal workers. We've seen huge impacts on informal neighborhoods or underserved neighborhoods. And actually, those same vulnerable groups are the ones that are going to be affected by the climate crisis as it continues, are in fact already being affected. We've just seen 2 hurricanes hit Central America, affecting those same groups of people. But in the future, you're going to see heat waves, you're going to see more and more storms, life-threatening risks occurring as we move forward. And so I think COVID actually brings an opportunity to rethink things, to reconsider, and to drive changes forward. And part of those changes need to be thinking about taking into account the potential for risks in the future and managing those risks. We also see a digital future for Latin America. We see renewable energy in Latin America. It's already very good for renewable energy, but we see the strengthening of that, electrification of transport systems, and also working a lot more with natural capital as we move forward, which will in essence give the results that you already spoke about, Sebastian, the reduced pollution, the better health, less time spent in traffic jams, and hopefully less natural disasters. But to be able to do that, you actually need long-term strategies to guide that development. And I really want to emphasize the role of long-term strategies as sort of guiding the whole of the SDGs. I think that that's an important conceptual step forward that we have. We really want to arrive at a situation by 2050 that avoids some of the errors that we've made in the past. We need to be able to look at some of these risks and incorporate that into our decision making. And the only way to do that is to start modeling and thinking about what those risks are and how those risks are going to affect development as we move forward. One of the biggest risks and one of the more complex ones is going to be, how do you manage fossil fuels? How do you manage the phase out of fossil fuels? There are fiscal impacts on that. There are multiple challenges with respect to that in the political economy of moving forward and ensuring just transitions. We also need to look and try and estimate what the technological and institutional changes will be in the future and how to bring those into the discussions about what that long term will look at. Clearly, sustainable recovery is going to cut across multiple sectors, just like decarbonization is going to cut across multiple sectors. You need resilient communities, we're going to need sustainable infrastructure, and we need to make this stuff stick, which means you have to change policy and you have to change financial systems so that those are actually much more resilient as we move into the future. But you're also going to have to flip some of the things that relate to fiscal revenues, removing subsidies, for fossil fuels, for example, and increasing taxation, green taxation that can actually rebalance the fiscal dynamics in countries. And also, as we already know, the fiscal challenges are going to mean that we need more private sector investment. So more ESG investing, sustainable infrastructure investing, and accessing capital markets through thematic bonds. This is all the material, this is all decarbonization strategies. This is the kind of stuff that you talk about when you're talking about a decarbonization strategy. And thinking on that 30-year timeline is actually a very complex process, because you're thinking while there's many changes going on. But the fact is, you still have to think over those 30 years, because that's going to help you make much better decisions. They're also, I think, another key aspect of the decarbonization strategies is that they're integrated. You need to think about how each thing affects everything else. And that situates these kinds of strategies, not so much in ministries of environment, but in ministries of finance, ministries of planning, so cabinets actually. Or if you're looking subnationally at the level of the whole government, it needs to be a whole government plan, which comes back to the SDGs. And I think you also need to look at some of the advantages of, if you think this way, you may be avoiding stranded assets in the long term. You may be being able to adjust to future transitions. In IDB, you've already mentioned, Sebastian, that one of the works we've been supporting is the deep decarbonization pathways for LAC. We actually have a lot of lessons learned arising from that work. It allows us to work, allows countries to work on their own versions of decarbonization scenarios. And I want to emphasize that it's often very country specific. the basic formula is similar, but the countries will each look very different in terms of how they address this. And it allows you to focus in the countries on 2050, not on what are the marginal changes that you're going to achieve by 2030 or 2025. It's not about that. It's about thinking in that long term, which I think is an extremely useful mindset to have for countries. And I just want to mention and you already mentioned this, Sebastian, we're already very, very happy that to see the support of 2050 Pathways platform, IDRI, and also the French Development Agency that have been very supportive of this. What have we learned? You already went through some of those things, but I do want to emphasize them. It is technically feasible. You can do this. This is not, before, I think 10 years ago, it would have been tricky to see how you do this, but today you can actually do this. Renewable energy is cheaper than fossil fuels. You can reduce congestion, you can affect health, you can reduce pollution, and you can intensify agriculture. What's interesting that you will notice that I'm talking about development outcomes, I'm not talking about greenhouse gas emissions. That is a big shift, and that's a very important shift that we're moving forward towards. I draw attention to the study that we just launched with Costa Rica, which actually shows that you can get $41 billion worth of benefits in Costa Rica up to 2050. Yes, there are upfront costs, but the long term brings you huge benefits to the whole country. And I think that that's an important also mindset change, that we've got to stop thinking about these things as costs and think about the savings that we're actually going to be making over time. We're also working now on transferring lessons amongst the countries. So what you can learn in Costa Rica, can it be applied in Peru? Can it be applied in Chile and Colombia? This is also a critical step forward in terms of what we're doing. And I repeat the importance of this engagement across all sectors. It's really about being able to deliver a whole government solution to these problems. And ultimately, I remember many, many years ago when the SDGs first came out, Achim Steiner basically said, look, the SDGs are a call for an integrated approach to planning. And I actually believe that decarbonization plans are the basis for actually implementing the SDGs, because they cut across all sectors. They have to be done with ministries of finance and ministries of planning. It is the way forward. And we're seeing that already in several countries. I think for Latin America, the really big models so far are Costa Rica and Chile, but we're also starting to see it in Colombia, Peru. There's some very interesting things going on in the Caribbean, in Barbados and Bahamas. So let's see where it all ends up. I would be remiss if I also didn't mention one other study that we've just done, which is on whole decarbonization and the fact that it actually will bring more jobs over time. And that we did with ILO. And I just wanted to finish on that note and say thank you again, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Graham. I think we might have some more questions afterwards on how you really make those long-term studies have an impact on decisions of the ministries of planning or etc. But that's for afterwards. First, I want to give the floor to Laurence. Laurence Breton-Moyer is the director of the Strategy, Partnerships and Communications at the French Development Agency. So Laurence, I already told about the 100% Paris alignment, but you might want to enter the conversation through another way, telling where you stand in this experimental or in this learning curve.
Yes, first of all, thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to share that experience on the deep decarbonization pathway, which we, as I will explain, trying to explain, has been a tremendous tool within our strategy. Well, just to start, what has Accord de Paris has told us is it has told that we need to discuss about trajectories and longer term vision, and the point was not anymore to do good climate project, but to really redirect the overall financial flows towards a climate compatible pathway. What SDG told us is we couldn't just do climate and social and gender and poverty one after the other, and we had to do all together. And that what the crisis told us is we didn't have any time, and now there is a tremendous slot for us to, because there will be some financial package. So it's really timely to have this conversation and to see how to fast track. Maybe to come back on the AFD, I think that maybe because it was in Paris Agreement, we were the first development bank to say, well, our new strategy will be, we had for a long time a strategy saying that we need to be climate for 50% of our activity. So to have 50% of our activity to have good climate projects. So we say, okay, as we had Dakar de Paris, we said, let's be Paris aligned. And then we started to think, what does that mean? Because we are a bank and we do finance projects. So, so the first thing was to really try to capture some view on the trajectory, and Paris Agreement say that the country had to prepare some trajectory. So of course, one of the points was to develop some capacity internally and in the dialogue to help some countries to have this long-term trajectory. But then, and I think maybe we'll come back later, was how, first of all, it's how you can analyze the trajectories, and I think we'll come back in a minute and in the questions in the deep decarbonization pathway methodology, which has been very useful to progress on that. But then you have to ask yourself, okay, how does my project or my investments are consistent with that trajectory? And that raises some tricky question. There are some projects with no regret, very easy, and there are some of them you like in some infrastructure or public transportation or in some kind of energy transition, you don't know, maybe it's good, maybe or not, maybe you may have some locking effect. So and of course we had to develop internally various tools on trajectories as the deep decarbonization pathway that we've been working with IDB and new IDRI things since 2018 in Latin America. Of course, to develop also try some analysis, because I have to say also that every project we have is gone through that analysis, both on Paris alignment, but as I was mentioning, and I think the way you put the question is, can we separate climate with SDG? I think it's no longer the question, is you have to take all together. So we had developed in parallel a methodology to analyze every of our operation along 6 dimensions. One of them is the climate. So I just summarized how we're trying to assess trajectories and to evaluate how the project is consistent. But we're trying to do that with the other, like inequalities, economic development, or biodiversity. So of course, on that regard, and I think what has been done on climate can be inspiring also in terms of long-term trajectory. Even the decarbonization pathway can, as Abraham just said, can address and tackle many sectors. There are still some methodology to be refined in terms of social or biodiversity, and I think that could be a good way to go further for that long-term strategy work. So of course, we have this SDG methodology. So we're asking every project manager to make that assessment. Of course, it raises more questions, and that's the value of the debates. But what I want to point out is, of course, it's not that interesting that AFD is doing that. But I think the interest is really to share and I'm sure that a friend Mohan from DBSA will explain that. But we have also discussed that within DBSA and with the DBSA and IDFC and with the financing Common Summit. We do believe, as you were mentioning, Maria Alexandra, that the Public Development Bank, and I think here we have a really good bunch of regional, kind of national, well, with international mandate we are, and the National Development Bank, because those banks, they represent in total 10% of the total investment worldwide. And they can directly have some impact in that percentage, which is already huge, and also give some incentive to private. So, and in the summit that I was almost a month ago, there is this willingness, and every public development bank, and especially nationals one, who have really grown a very important role to play in their national economy, they are willing and they have committed to be aligned with SDG and Paris alignment, Paris Agreement, sorry. So, and I think it's now very important to see how to accelerate some of kind of peer exchange, dialogue about how these, and I'm sure we'll come back later in the discussions about these tools that we have experienced in Latin America, the methodology itself of this long-term strategy, how you can use that to make some back and forth with some of the short-term decision on national policies, and also how to how to fast track and share and make convergence of that methodology to have some kind of common ground of dialogue, and help orient all the investments that we can all have public development bank direct, especially in that period where all these banks are in the forefront of the recovery, and most of them have increased by 30–50% their investments, and also give some orientation to the private sector. So, just very, very important work which has been done with long-term strategy and work on deep decarbonization pathway. And now I think it's really very important to see how to extend that to other sector, and to see, even though it's already very cross-cutting, how to go to more integrate. And I'm sure that also our friend from IBC will address this just transition. There are really high needs for also social and justice, climate justice, and there are social needs which are of inequalities, which of course with the crisis we know will be in the top of any political agenda. So there is an urgent need to see how to extend that long-term strategy analysis in a SDG way, and how to extend and converge, have some convergence of methodology, and use that tools as really a ground for dialogue, for policy decision strategy, but also how to reconcile with some short-term investment decision. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laurence. I think you offer a very important transition for Mohan. Mohan Vivekanandan is the Group Executive for Origin and Client Coverage at Development Bank of South Africa. And before COP21 at IDRI, we worked with South African colleagues on what would a deep decarbonization pathway look like for South Africa. And of course, they were telling us, what matters most in our country is the question of inequality. And so that's probably something where the social dimension that Laurence was mentioning is something that you probably have very, very much at the center of your work, Mohan. But this is just a way of a transition. The floor is yours for positioning also how you want to position the question of today about long-term goals and the role of public development banks. Please.
Great. Thank you very much, Sebastian, and everyone for the opportunity. Again, my name is Mohan Vivekanandan, dialing in from Johannesburg with the Development Bank of Southern Africa. And it's good to see our partners from AFD as well. We're working closely with them, utilizing some lines of credit from them, and looking at issuing a green bond with their support upcoming. So it's a good partnership for us. What I thought I would do in the limited time that I have is maybe go into and give the listeners a specific example of how we as a National Development Bank have put in place, and I think I referred to the comments from Graham about the detailed plans that are needed to drive, this alignment of financing with actual projects. And specifically, one of the key challenges in South Africa has been around not just the energy transition, but just energy generation. Because unfortunately, we've gotten ourselves into a position where we just haven't had enough power to be able to drive the economy. And it's been a big constraint. Even before COVID, as an example, the South African economy was in a recession. And a lot of that was just being driven by energy constraints. And those constraints are, as you can imagine, even greater in other countries in sub-Saharan Africa where we as the DBSA operate. I did prepare a short presentation. I'm going to try and share it, but maybe just focus specifically on the Independent Power Producer Program in South Africa and the role that we as the DBSA played around that, and hopefully just help to use that to give a bit of an example, if you don't mind. So I'm going to try and share, and hopefully the technology doesn't let us down. Can everybody see this presentation?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. It's just a little bit about the DBSA. I won't go into it in much detail, except we're fully owned by the South African government, and really our focus is around sustainable infrastructure on the African continent. And one of the key elements is we do think about this in an integrated approach, meaning, yes, in the middle, we do provide long tenor financing, especially senior and subordinated debt to both corporate and project finance structures. But really the critical element is earlier on in ensuring that the plans are in place and then the preparation work is done for projects to ensure that as we finance them, we're financing them in an appropriate manner. And also just want to highlight the fact that the work that we do is aligned to national, regional, meaning African, and then global priorities and plans. So in the case of, on a national basis, we've got something called the National Development Plan, which is a long-term view in South Africa. On the regional side, there's various sub-regional and pan-continental infrastructure master plans. And then obviously the SDGs and the Paris Agreement at a more global level that we've signed up to. Now, specifically, let me then talk about the work that we're doing on the energy side, and specifically the work around the Independent Power Producer Program with a big focus on renewable energy. It's a program that was set up roughly 10 years ago, and we as the DBSA, as a national DFI, played quite a critical role in helping to set up and manage the IPP office. And this office helped to effectively give a long-term view of the power requirement, both from a supply and demand side for South Africa, which then helped to launch a very large program by South African standards, about 6,000 megawatts of renewable energy, about 200 billion rands, which is, let's say, roughly 12 to $15 billion worth of capital expenditure. And now, this third bullet point, we're working on a 2 gigawatt program called the Risk Mitigation IPP program, which is focusing on dispatchable power, looking at about 70 billion rands of CapEx. So again, at an exchange rate of about 15 to the dollar, I don't know, maybe about $5 billion or so. In addition, with help from the Green Climate Fund, based out of Seoul, of which we're an accredited entity, we've set up a climate finance facility for private sector investments in renewable energy and other green financing, and also an embedded generation program that's helping to support not just private sector, but also more subnational public sector entities, municipalities, state-owned entities as well, in developing their own renewable energy. Just some of the highlights here, on this IPP program, as I said, it's been 80 plus projects, over 5,000 megawatts of renewable energy. And also a critical element in the country has been the fact that it's also allowed participation by local entities, including previously disadvantaged Black South African entities, in project ownership, in the construction, and in the operations and maintenance of these projects. So it's basically capturing the entire value chain of the project to benefit the country as well. And I think just some of the lessons learned from this as a national DFI is that national development finance institutions, public development banks, are uniquely placed to engage with local public and private sector stakeholders. As an example, we report to the Finance Ministry. As I mentioned, we manage the Independent Power Producer Office on behalf of the Department of Energy. But on a number of projects, we work closely with the various commercial banks, asset managers in the country. So, we're able to play that role of bringing together the planning side from the government with those entities that are going to provide the capital. And I saw one of the questions coming through was, where do we find the capital? Well, the capital has to come often from institutional investors. And so, bringing those entities on board as well. And also ensuring that critical local requirements are taken into account in the planning for this energy transition. I mentioned local ownership. How do we make sure that we, ensure that industrialization is taking place in these emerging economies as we're making this energy transition, and also focusing on regional development requirements as well. So those are some of the examples of the role pretty tangibly that we're able to play as a national development bank in helping to promote the energy transition, which is aligned obviously to the Paris Agreement, but is also meeting other requirements that the country has. So I think with that, I'm going to stop and maybe we can take questions down the line. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mohan. That was really good to also have a very concrete illustration. So maybe we had prepared three types of questions, but maybe it's not completely worth separating our conversation. And I would like to ask the two first questions in a row and have you react on them. To some extent, I think it would be good also for the audience to understand a little bit more in detail, concretely, what does it mean to have a group of consultants or researchers produce a report that is a long-term low emissions development strategy, a deep decarbonization strategy that is compatible, that is a development strategy compatible with the Paris Agreement. And how do you use that? What are the methodologies that are necessary in those types of reports for you to be able to use them in order to assess the alignment of your processes, your projects, to build a type of project, to interact with other players. So could you give examples of how concretely that works, and what are the requirements for you from your side of what you need these studies or these reports to be for them to be able to feed into what you need to discuss internally or externally in terms of alignment. Laurence, I don't know if you are ready for that, but that was to some extent what you were refraining from saying in the first round of questions. So how do you see these methodological issues, and concretely, what does it mean to use those long-term strategies?
Well, I think they can be different type of use, and maybe one of the example that has been very useful for us was the one developed in Costa Rica, by which the government, using the deep decarbonization pathway modeling results, included in that well, there were 70 targets within 35 government agencies and 9 ministries, so declining into strategy, sectoral strategy. And for example, after that, IDB and ourselves, we could align in some kind of what we call policy-based loan, which means that you make a loan based on some results and policy. And of course, having based on that long-term analysis and strategy and the declination within few sectors, that was the basis on the dialogue. And we were able to make some loan based on the policy results that was approved. So that's one of the examples. And that's, for example, very useful for us because and of course, that's the ultimate goal we want. I was mentioning there is really not real interest that we do this analysis for ourselves. So the country using that and mainstreaming that in some of the policy could drive very easily some of the international investments that are put in the country. As I was mentioning in some other example, some of the long-term strategy can help to be in as we have done also in Colombia, to be driven in a few sectoral, and then that's really helpful, like when you have energy transition strategy, which is built in detail, to be able, whenever you have an investment and then you are in a project type of financing, to better assess. And there are still some tools and things, some work to be done there to bridge the gap. But still, I mean, that gives some kind of help to at least for some project to have the dialogue and try to assess how the project is in line, short-term project in this line with this longer-term strategy. I think maybe the third point I wanted to raise is, as I was mentioning, it's kind of very useful, like a deep decarbonization pathway, as was mentioning in South Africa. One of the main issues is the stranded asset and the coal way phasing out. So how these can help to build some dialogue and identify maybe some kind of cross-sectoral issues and cross-sectoral policies, either fiscal, either setting some social net, or either, as we've been discussing with DBSA, having some support to some territories and local municipalities to help the transition of the territory, because of course a lot of people will lose their job, so it's not anymore an energy issue, it's kind of a social and a transition issue, how to organize maybe some kind of new activity or training of capacity building. So I think that these three examples, I think for me are really a very important example on how we could enlarge and use more and develop further technologies on this long-term strategy to help that decision, to help direct some international investments, to help target some project financing, and of cross-sectoral, cross-ministerial dialogue to see how to better align the various policies in terms of employment, fiscal, energy, well, cross-sectoral dialogue also.
Thank you, Laurence. Maybe I had a complementary question on if I understood you well. The idea is that these long-term strategies are useful in the dialogue with the government, interministerial, but still the government. Do you see also the usefulness of them to also engage in a dialogue with other stakeholders? I think you mentioned that, but I just wanted to give you the opportunity.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, there is a dialogue. As you rightly pointed, I would say still at the kind of political level, government and the financial system. But what was very useful also on the methodology of the deep decarbonization pathway was there were these setting with civil society, research center to have also a dialogue, because of course the methodology can give some numbers and figures and how to cope with some long-term strategy and what type of longer-term target, but there are still some very crucial political in terms of acceptability and choices in terms of society choice, consumption choice, and as we see right now, even with the crisis, there will be some really very difficult question about where you put the money, what type of social kind of new agreement you want to build with at all levels, at the national level, at the local territories level, with the civil society. So I think that one of the very useful also in the methodology in this deep decarbonization pathway method was to bring that dialogue and to help beyond the numbers, to have this really citizens between citizens and help also the politics to be able to take the right decision. I mean, we have seen in France some very difficult decisions, which were included in the French long-term strategy in terms of climate, to face some very difficult issues because there were some social, and we had the Bonnet Rouge, we had the Gilets jaunes.
Laurence, we just lost you for a moment.
Gilets jaunes, but
I'm sorry, Laurence.
That's really critical.
Yes, we missed a little bit of what you were saying because of a connection problem, Laurence. But I think we got your point about the idea of a social contract that necessitates citizens' conversation. If you agree, I will turn and I'll come back to you afterwards, Laurence. Thank you very much for that. I will turn to Graham. So you've mentioned all the lessons learned. Could you maybe tell us a little bit concretely how you see the direct use of these long-term strategies in the processes that you have in the project, in creating the type of project, in assessing the type of project, in organizing the dialogue with citizens, like Laurence was saying. So I think it's very important for the audience to understand that very often you could say that a future study, a report on the long-term future is something you put on a shelf and nobody looks at. And it's really striking to see you three saying, no, it matters. It's useful. It's used. So how do you put that in use? Could you give example and tell us why it's so, how you make it important, how you make it matter?
Well, just a little bit of context. I mean, the key issues when you're talking to governments are usually run out of our country offices, the offices that sit in the countries, and they have the dialogues directly with the governments. And that dialogue leads to the development of what we call a country strategy. It's a very common tool that you have, and to basically programming decisions that occur that basically define what operations the bank is going to be financing in that particular country. So that is a bit of context. Right now, the way we've been approaching those is to try and support our representatives in the countries with discussions on sustainable recovery, but it's quite a generic discussion. It's sort of, you want to help in the policy context, you want to help with the productive sectors, sustainable productive sectors, and you want to move forward social resilience, as it were. But it's quite generic, and it's kind of high level. What we're actually thinking about doing right now, and this comes from the COVID crisis, is decentralizing our people from headquarters into countries so that they can actually work directly with the representatives. And what the three areas of work that we really want to focus on are, in fact, the dialogues and knowledge that relate to this line between long-term strategies, NDC ambition, policies, and institutions. Now, I want to put a caveat there. This is not going to work in every country. This only will work in countries that are interested in moving forward with this agenda. But that's one area of work. But the key reason for doing that is to then align that to the concessional finance amounts. And I'm going here to that question that was asked about where's the money going to come from for all of this. So you then think about, okay, well, how do I bring concessional finance into a country, but with the express purpose of leveraging against our ordinary capital, our own capital, plus leveraging, and this was a comment Mohan made, leveraging against both public and private sector financing. And private sector financing, yes, institutional investors, capital markets, and things like that. So how do you bring all of that together? And then the third area is really making sure you're using the concessional finance to leverage against our own capital, but you're also providing technical assistance to make sure our own capital is contributing to both resilience and to mitigation actions on the ground. If you, right now, doing that, and you do the calculations roughly, you're looking at about 100 to 155 million annually for Latin America and the Caribbean that we're dealing with for concessional finance. But you're talking about 4 to 5 billion in terms of our ordinary capital, and probably a similar number, though we're still working on how to calculate all of this, for mobilization. So you're actually talking about $10 billion a year now. The question is, how do you grow those amounts? How do you actually increase that? Part of it is you can grow the concessional finance and then and focus on the leveraging, so you can actually leverage more. But one of the things that we're also discussing in response to COVID is a capital increase, which would actually increase the amount of ordinary capital that we have available to move forward. I also want to mention that in some countries, this is already, the agenda is already moving, it's already advancing. And Lawrence already mentioned the question of Costa Rica and how that's moving, but it's not just about the policy-based loan, it's also about aligning our other operations to that decarbonization plan and looking at opportunities in the plan for future investments. And I think that that's a key step forward, and that's what I want to see happening in a lot of different countries as we move forward. I think Chile is another very good example where they've used long-term thinking to increase ambition in the NDC, and we're also supporting looking at critical issues like political economy, looking at just transition. What is going to happen when you phase out coal, and how do you manage that, and how do you provide the knowledge about that? I also think Colombia, as Lawrence mentioned, is another very interesting example where you can bring to tie together all of these agendas in a single sort of flow. Now, that's perfect world. Costa Rica is always perfect world, but if they can do it, other countries can do it too. So that's where we really want to go as we move forward.
I just want to have a complementary question, Graham, because that's also a question from the audience. Following Costa Rica as the perfect world and the other countries not having all the same situation, there is a question from the audience saying this is all good, but this necessitates a lot of local capacity. And you mentioned institutions and policy. So how do you do in countries where you don't have the analytical capacity, where you don't have the citizens dialogue, where you don't have the institutional capacity to develop those pathways? I mean, one thing that the DDP, the Deep Decarbonization Pathways project is insisting on is that it should not be IDRI or WRI or a university based in England or Netherlands that develops those things. It needs to be national capacity. So how do you see that from IADB?
So there I think the key is those concessional funds and how you use those concessional funds in countries and how you develop technical assistance. DDP-LAC is a great model for that because it's focused on building the capacity in the country to build those models, to be able to have those initial dialogues. But it needs to go further than that. We need to be able to support, and here I want to emphasize this, we need to be able to support those institutions, those entities that are responsible for climate or environmental issues, and their capacity to interact with the most powerful institutions in the country, which tend to be, you can go to the cabinets or you can go to the ministries of finance, the ministries of planning. That's where this stuff needs to be situated because they then need to influence the sectors. Because if you don't change the sectors, we're not going to be really doing anything. But that's a lot of work. And this is, and again, I repeat, one of the reasons I want to move people to be able to support directly our country offices is that we can have those dialogues and better direct our concessional finance, our technical assistance to actually build those capacities as we move forward. But it's absolutely a great question. It's one of the key problems that we're facing in many countries.
Thank you, Graham. I think, Mohan, you wanted to, oh, sorry, Laurence. I wanted to give the floor to Mohan and then come back to you, but I think he also wants to react just on that. So I'm sorry, I'm going to give him the floor and then come back to you. So Mohan, from your side, how do you see the concrete implementation and the question of capacity?
Sure. I mean, so as an example, one of the things we've done is the DBSA, we're part of two organizations in Africa of national development banks. One is within SADC, the Southern African Development Community, a group of about 40 DFIs. And the other is the Association of African DFIs as well, which is obviously a Pan-African grouping. But within the SADC DFI network, what you have is a lot of very subscale DFIs. They don't have the balance sheet to be able to fund the energy transition projects in their country. They don't often don't have the skills to do the due diligence on those projects either. But what they do have is they report into the finance ministries of those countries. So they have access to the key decision makers in those countries. So what we've done is we've created these working groups within the SADC DFI community. One is a working group of about 10 entities, DFIs focused on infrastructure. And we work with them to prioritize the infrastructure investments, help set up the equivalent of an IPP office if there's that need and willingness in those countries. But if not, to work with them to jointly identify the right projects to finance, to do the due diligence on those projects, and then to co-finance them so that we are building up that capacity within the National Development Bank of these countries, of a Malawi, of a Mozambique, of an Eswatini, of a Lesotho. So that, those are tangible examples of national development banks working together to address, climate transition in these less developed countries.
Laurence, you wanted to come in on that.
Yeah, so I'm going to cut the image. I think maybe the connection will be better. No, I just wanted to quickly react on grammar and fully agree that the key issue is concessional money. And to come back on Maria Alessandra introducing word, national development bank for us are key players. They are the one who can also gather around them all the local player actor. And we should think, and that was one of the aim on Financing Common Summit, to have that coalition to share capacity building, but also to help them to access to concessional money, international concessional money, which is not enough going down to national development bank. That was one of the key, I think, constraints that would identify was the mandates, but also access. And we do believe that the Green Climate Fund was the first really to be open. And we also supporting kind of access to National Development Bank, to the Green Climate Fund. And we do think that there should be some more thoughts about international finance architecture to see how to open more, like has done the Green Climate Fund, for national entities like National Development Bank to access this concessional fund precisely to reinforce capacity to develop tools, and of course, with the support of international community to make sure that there are some convergence on these methodologies. But I just wanted to fully agree on Graham's point and even push further some maybe new ideas about opening other than the Green Climate Fund to some national development banks.
Thank you, Laurence. I just want to turn to Maria Alejandra. Maybe you want to come in on commenting or things that you have observed in those development banks that are sitting around this virtual table or some others.
Yes, thank you, Sebastian. I think hearing what all of you just have been mentioning, the idea of being aware that public development banks are allies not only through their financing services, but also through their non-financing services is key as a conclusion from this webinar, because it's a matter of being strategic on how to combine this concessional finance that they can provide together with non-financial services such as capacity building, such as having an active role at the policy table, bringing their knowledge, their mainly, for example, national development banks who are closer to the territories, closer to the communities, who have lessons learned on what has been working so far in the region and what has not worked. So they have all these background information that they can bring to the policy table and use it as an input to build up strong long-term strategies in the countries in which they operate. So I think this is important for public development banks to be aware and to lead in these different roles that they can have. And also, I think it's important, as Laurence was saying, for the need to rethink this architecture of financial institutions in a way that, for instance, big public development banks as AFD or the IDB can be key allies to those national development banks and to those subnational development banks that work on the ground to help them strengthen their capacities, to help them access these international markets and international funds, and guide them on a way on how to be more impactful with these investments and the development of sustainable development strategies on the ground.
Thank you very much, Maria Alejandra. I think I will, before the end of the webinar, come back to the issue of how do we have a common approach among development banks to learn, to do a learning approach, a community of practice on these subjects. Some of you already came into that question, but I have a question from the audience that is still a little bit more specific on how do we analyze the situation of a country and its long-term perspectives. And the question is from Gonzalo Bravo. Do the banks foresee any systematized strategy for analyzing the impacts on local employment of those suggested decarbonization path and long-term strategies? And maybe I want to turn, I don't know if this is easy for you to react on, Mohan, but to some extent, in your presentation, you told us that the key element for your IPP was not the key element, one of the key analytical elements is this energy transition strategy. To what extent is this energy transition strategy a development strategy that also looks at intersectorial impacts on jobs and employment? Because I believe, like any other country, but particularly for an emerging economy like South Africa, the issue of how you help the structural transformation of the economy and the workforce to transition from primary to secondary to tertiary sectors, all these questions are probably embedded in the energy transition question. But is it possible to analyze it all jointly. How did you do that, or how would you answer the question by Gonzalo Bravo?
Yeah, you know, I mean, I think we do need to do more work around it. The one thing I know, just you know, as we speak now, we've been approving a number of projects as part of this risk mitigation IPP program in South Africa. Just today, we approved about 10 investments, and one of the key elements that and these are bids. So what's going to be happening is the project sponsors are going to be submitting bids, and the bids are going to be selected based on different criteria. I mean, the main one is the dispatchability of the power and the cost per kilowatt hour of that power. But one of the other criteria that is going to be used is how much it's going to promote local industrialization, including job creation, in the country. So it is something that the Independent Power Producer Office in South Africa has to be able to, judge all of the different bids against, because there's going to be bids coming in for 2,000 megawatts of projects. So it's a good question, and it's something that it's a capacity and skill set that they have, and they are building up to be able to judge these different projects. Because one of the criticisms that they had received in the earlier rounds of the renewable energy IPP projects that I referred to was there hadn't been as much of the industrialization delivered as we would have liked with the amount of money that had been spent in this. So it is something that we're looking and we are developing as a country. But I think maybe it's something as an additional piece of research to understand how they're actually doing that and how they're making those judgments. And
just a quick comment on this. We actually just published a paper that looks at, across Latin America and the Caribbean, across all countries, and we did this with the International Labour Organization. What are the impacts or the changes that we're likely to see as you decarbonize Latin America and the Caribbean, which actually specifically asks what's going to happen to jobs in energy, what's going to happen to jobs in transport, industry, agriculture, across countries. The good news and the take-home message is that there will actually be more jobs created than lost. Probably we estimate around 15 million new jobs created rather than lost. But I will actually post that publication so people can see it. And we're already moving forward with additional discussions on how labor markets also need to respond in the context of ensuring a just transition. It's not just labor markets, it's also the question of whether or not you need reskilling centers. There are a couple of examples of new long-term strategies that incorporate into them the context, the concept of actually putting in reskilling training, which is critical to be able to move forward and manage that transition effectively. So I just wanted to comment on that, and I'll find the publication and I'll put it into the chat.
Laurence, I also turn to you because if I don't know if that's the right way to have you to ask you the question, but I know that in the French Development Agency, there is the idea to have a portfolio of projects that is 100% Paris aligned, but it should be also 100% social bond, meaning social capital. And behind that, of course, there is the issue of jobs, qualification, etc. How do you see the challenge? I mean, the question by the person from the audience was, how can we systematize the capacity, the analytical capacity to assess not only decarbonization, but at the same time jobs creation? Is that something that you have that you have been trying, experimenting, or do you have lessons on that?
Well, that's one of the key, I think, evolution here. I was mentioning this SDG methodology around six dimensions, and one of them that we among the progress that we need to make is definitely the question of decent employment, because it's not only employment but it's decent employment also. So we've made some initial work on that to see and trying to assess for project, and I think that the other thing is also how to integrate in some of the program, like we've been doing in public transportation or in other. If you finance an infrastructure, then you know there will be some job transition to be made. Like if you finance a new mass rapid transit, then a lot of bus drivers are going to lose their jobs. So you know that, but the question is how you assess that. That's the first thing. So we're trying to enhance, and I think there are some work to be done also with a just transition initiative that we're launching, trying to see how to enhance our capacity to address and develop some methodology to better understand the impact and employment. And then is how you address the solution in front of the problem that you have addressed. So it's also, and that comes about as I was mentioning earlier, how you manage also to have some kind of cross-sectoral solution. Because whenever you address decarbonization, you need then to invest in some of the new industries, but you need to help the other one to make the transition, all territories. So that's also a key question that raised the question of not only the project, but some of the portfolio notions and that's where I guess the dialogue along long-term trajectory made at the country level can help also to coordinate some of the financing capacities from National Development Bank, international investments, to make sure that one project cannot handle all the dimension, but to make sure that you have the view on the longer term and all things that need to be addressed at the same time. So definitely employment and inequalities also are crucial to be integrated in decarbonization.
So I'm taking a last question from the audience on that before transitioning to the final discussion that we could have on how do we organize a community of practitioners at the scale of development banks, and I think you've already touched upon that. But the last question from the audience is about the coherence within one development bank, because it might happen, and we see that. I'm not talking about your three organizations. You will have to answer for them, but that some development banks have climate-aligned projects and fossil fuel projects on the other hand. How do you ensure in your organizations the coherence and the alignment of the whole portfolio of your whole organization with the decarbonization pathway? I mean, that's probably the basic things that we're discussing today, that if you have a long-term strategy, then you can really see what is aligned and not aligned. But still, how can you really deal with the fact that it's not that easy to be completely consistent across the whole portfolio? Maybe I can turn to Mohan.
Yeah. No, I think it's a fair question, but the reality is all of these NDCs, give an opportunity for the countries to develop their own pathways that over time, come to these solutions. So as an example, and I think this key element here is what are the resource endowments in a lot of these emerging economies. So, I mean, we know that Germany is still burning lignite right now as we speak, and they said I think maybe by 2038 they'll get around to shutting down those power plants. So in the case of Southern Africa, there's a lot of coal. In the case now of East Africa, there's some very significant gas deposits that have been discovered, and what we are looking at is how do we use those to help do a transition of these economies to the clean pathway that we're looking for. But certainly, I think in the sense of coal, I think there seems to be an alignment that is really not the best way to go, and for us not to fund those projects going forward. But certainly on the gas side, there's a significant role we still think for gas-fired power, especially as a transition fuel, to build in for renewable energy. I mean, Graham made the comment that renewable energy is cheaper, and I think it is. But are we, is dispatchable power from renewable cheaper than from thermal sources? And I'm not sure it is. Certainly the numbers that I've seen just in the last week as we've been approving these projects, they're not cheaper. So there is a role, for instance, for gas-fired power as an example, as long as it's part of this bigger, broader plan that's in place of how you are making this transition. And you're not dependent on it forever. You're bringing in significant amounts of renewables as an example, but we do believe there's a role for certain fossil fuels.
Thank you, Mohan. And I think that raises the question of how your long-term strategy enables you not to be locked into this dependency on the transition, on the gas transition facility that you've been investing in, so that it does not become a stranded asset when you need to transition to something else. Graham or Laurence, you want to add something on that? I think Graham has already unmuted, so please go ahead.
Well, quickly, I mean, this is all part of the process of the way in which the MDBs are trying to work together on Paris alignment, in essence. And I think one key message is that, and I think Mohan already said this, is that the idea is to support the countries in terms of achieving their own alignment to Paris over time. I completely agree that we need to ensure coherence within Development Bank, but Mohan also raised questions about gas that are dynamic, that they're moving. 10 years ago, there was a different discussion on gas, and in 5 years, it's going to be different again. So we need to be communicating very effectively within the banks and across banks in terms of what's going on today and what may be going on in 5 years' time, which is a tricky discussion to have. But one way to do that is to make sure that you have alignment from the strategies all the way through, strategies and policies all the way through the bank. So you make sure that your structures, the structures that the board members can actually influence, which are basically strategies and policies, are in fact aligned bit by bit. But I do see it as a stepwise process. We're making advances. We're moving slowly towards, well, for example, in the IDB, what we could in the future hopefully call Paris alignment. And there, I think it's making sure that your projects are aligned and being able to evaluate whether or not they're aligned, both for resilience and for mitigation. It's about what we do in terms of supporting governments and making sure that we're bringing those concessional resources to help build the capacity of governments so that they can move forward that agenda. There is a reality that very few countries actually have long-term strategies. So, you know, it's difficult to say you're going to align to a long-term strategy when the countries doesn't even have a long-term strategy. But it's great that we're moving in that direction where hopefully long-term strategies will guide NDCs in the future. And I also think this question of aligning finance is going to be critical as well for the MDBs, is making sure that those concessional resources are really maximized in terms of their use for transformation towards hopefully what are the long-term strategy goals. So I think that there are ways of doing this, but I completely agree it's a challenge and it's something that we're dealing with day to day.
Thank you very much. Laurence, you want to add something on that? I think you might want to shut your video again.
Fully agreed on your key. Oh.
Sorry.
No, just fully agree that you very important question, and it's very difficult to assess a project in itself. So that's why it's very important to have trajectories. But we also need, maybe I anticipate your next point, but we also need to have more consistent, convergent methodology and also capacity to assess the credibility of the methodology. Because the example you gave, yes, could be a good project in a very well put in and dynamic strategy to phase out, and the same project could have really lock-in effect in some other circumstances. So the quality, the credibility of that long-term strategy is key to be able to, and that has to be done at national level. But that's where it comes into the question, how to make sure that to extend and to support the country that do not have long-term strategy to build them in a very kind of a standard manner and credible manner, to make sure that, you know, that what is being developed goes fast enough in the right direction. So it's, but I guess that was also a question of norms or standards. So how to extend that work that we've been doing in Latin America.
Maybe, Laurence, this is the question that I want to ask the three of you as final remarks. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that? How do we need to standardize these approaches to long-term strategies in order for them to be more credible, to be able to disseminate to other financial players? I know that DBSA and AFD are part of the IDFC, the International Development Funders Club. That is one of those clubs. Graham was mentioning the MDB's efforts to see how they develop maybe not a completely unique approach, but a standardized level of norms and standards on how you approach Paris alignment and the question of long-term strategy that is integral to the question of long-term of alignment with Paris or with the SDGs. How do you see this process, this common learning process and building common norms? Laurence, if you want to come in on that.
Well, just to follow up, it's very important, and as you were mentioning, there are some declination. The way to decline it might be national by national, context by context, but there are some methodology in terms of assess, but also the process that you were mentioning, how to gather the civil society. So the process itself is important. If we want to fast track the use of that, there needs to be some kind of standards and norms. And if we want to be able to discuss among ourselves and around the results of that strategy, there needs to be some kind of homogeneity. So that's for us very important. And that's, I was mentioning work that has been starting within the IDFC club, so 24 of the biggest national development bank, to help also to fast track and have some peer experience, peer exchange, and also how to organize the debates to implement the results. But the point I wanted to make is also, it could be very important to ask ourselves if there could be, like, IMF play a key role in macroeconomic assessment of macroeconomic trajectory. Could there be some kind of international voice somewhere that what they think about the long-term strategy that have been developed? Because that would be very helpful for us, as Graham was mentioning, to align some of the financing. And whenever there is a good strategy, we could, flow some kind of budgetary money. And wherever we have the feeling the strategy is not exactly fast enough or doesn't grab or has trouble with some of the social impact, then we could put concessional money and make more support to find the right way to go through. So that's also the question, how to fast track to exchange and to have some, and within IDFC and financing common coalition. So one of the objectives is to develop this kind of technical assistance per exchange. But beyond that, how could we help to emerge some kind of international voice to make an assessment of that trajectory that would considerably fast track all our job and help to align all financial flows towards SDGs.
Thank you very much, Laurence. I turn to you, Mohan. You've been telling us to what extent DBSA is working with national or subnational DFIs in Southern Africa to try and convey the approach that you're using. How do you see the other communities through which we should try and harmonize or build a community of practice around these issues of aligning with long-term goals?
Yeah, I think it will be quite useful. I guess the analogy is, on an individual project level, we align our SDG reviews to things like, for instance, the Equator Principles from the IFC and the World Bank and such. So, if that's at an individual project level, there may be a way to think about coming up with these standards and norms for thinking about the long-term strategies that countries have, their NDCs as an example, and working to review those, one, to see, how aligned are they and how ambitious are they? And then two, to see, are the countries then actually, executing against those NDCs, or are they kind of pieces of paper, but they're actually doing something quite different? So I think it is something that could be quite helpful, but as I think Graham made the comment, in a lot of cases, these long-term plans really aren't there. So the NDCs are kind of there, but it's at a high level. And as it comes into sector-specific areas, those long-term plans don't exist. So one of the critical elements for us as, let's say, more capacitated public development banks is to help to ensure that those more detailed plans are put in place and that those detailed plans are ambitious and aligned to the future that we'd like to see.
Thank you very much, Mohan. Graham, from your side, you said you were developing these types of common approaches within the I would say the club of the MDBs. It's not a club; it's just the MDBs existing. But how do you see also the capacity of your lessons learned to disseminate to other players, or the role that Laurence was advocating for the IMF? Any reaction on that, or any information on how you intend to try and participate to this learning process?
So I think the general guidance is going to be key to help countries structure LTSs in the future. I do say that each country is going to be different, and this is one of the things that we're finding. We ourselves are learning lessons from the support from the DDP-LAC program, and we're exchanging those through different kinds of networks and processes, and I think that's super valuable. Every time I listen to those, I learn a great deal. I also think that the UN Secretary General's announcement on the global coalition on carbon neutrality is going to be key. That I think that this needs to be one of the guiding things about the future. This is the vision that we want to get to in the future as a mechanism to drive that forward. And I think, as we've discussed today, there are clearly areas where we need to be sharing information and sharing understanding and sharing knowledge. Laurence mentioned the question of stakeholder engagement, and how do you bring this information to actually influence ministries of finance and planning and sector ministries? So this is it's complex. It's a very difficult thing to do. How do you do it? Does it work in some countries? How does it work in other countries? I also think, and Mohan raised this, I mean, the question of fossil fuel phase outs and natural gas in particular, especially since information is emerging day by day almost on things like leakage and calculations, all the way across to how do you balance the delivery of dispatchable power against the climate objectives, and how do you manage all of that, and how do you bring it all together? These are all critical questions that need much more discussion and much more sharing of information. And the last area, I think, is this question of just transition. I mean, one of the failures of almost all change processes is where you don't take into account the fact that you've got winners and losers. And those losers derail your whole process. And we need to be super careful about that as we move forward. And again, it's going to be country specific. And there needs to be a lot of discussion about how do you manage those kinds of things. There's already a lot of lessons learned on this stuff from past processes. So let's start bringing that together and discussing it. So and I'm sure there are additional areas where more specific areas related to decarbonization that we need to be sharing information on, but those three sort of jump out right now. But anyway, thanks very much for this. This has been great, very useful for me as well.
Thank you very much, Graham. Very kind of you to say so. We actually really now we have to close the seminar because we're reaching the final limit. But I think I think one of the objectives was really, I mean, the co-benefit is that you've learned from one another. I would not be sure because you know already one another so well, but that's good news. Thank you very much for that, Graham. And I think as it's an ongoing work I mean, it's a lot of work. It's a big challenge that we are discussing. Of course, we're always learning. I think the idea was also to try and make it a little bit more tangible what we mean by these long-term strategies, because we in a small community we all understand one another about the idea that we need to avoid lock-in, that there are stranded assets, that we need to look at long-term, etc. But it needs to be also made quite tangible, and you did a great job, all the three of you and Maria Alejandra, also to show to what extent this is just really put at use in your organizations and in the discussions that your organization have with a variety of players. So I want to thank you very, very much, the three of you, for having accepted our invitation and being, I mean, this conversation was extremely, you reacted on one another's comments, and that was exactly what we need in those types of webinars. Thank you very much for being such good panelists. Thank you very much, Maria Alejandra, for your inputs from the study that you've been doing. I also want to thank very much Karine, our communications officer, who's been extremely useful in setting up that meeting, and she does that every time very, very well. Thank you very much, Karine, and to the whole IDRI team that has designed the seminar. I hope we have another webinar of that type in like 6 months or 1 year to see how we've progressed on this issue of social just transition that has been one of the key challenges still ahead of us, as you mentioned, Roland, and also the audience. So thank you very much. See you in a while, I hope, for further learnings from your experiences. Thank you.
Thanks to you. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.